She started to sweat, as if she was in a panic. And she came to a stop. It was after she'd embraced herself that she felt a pain, and it went dark.
So welcome to Choreographer's Cut.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So the work we're going to be looking at is Haunted.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the work?
Haunted was, I mean, I was going to say it was the first full-length piece I made, but actually it was commissioned originally as a 15-minute piece by Emma Gladstone, actually, a slot called Rhythm Method at South Bank. Mm. So it was at the Purcell Rooms, I remember. I know they gave me, I was working in the Hot House. There was a little studio down the side of the festival hall that I worked in a bit, and Jacob Street Studios, I remember, on Tooley Street. So yeah, it was a 15-minute commission by Emma Gladstone, which was really what the piece as it exists was the first 15 minutes, which I then added onto. Mm-hmm. So what you see in the first 15 minutes is the original commission, and then subsequently I completed the piece, I think with the help of the Arts Council, I'm pretty sure. Yes. Yeah.
So this became a trilogy of work before we come back to Haunted, because I know that's the one you really wanted to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, it did become... so, yeah, the order of events was, I think, around 94, 95, the 15-minute commission for Haunted. Then following that, I extended it to a full-length piece, 50 minutes-ish. And then following that, I also then made what I thought was a follow-up, which was called Daunted. And then as a sort of really pushing my luck, I finished with a piece called Flaunted, which was like a finale, you know, slightly referencing bits of Haunted, but very loosely. So, yeah, it was a sort of way of just keep adding on to this sort of original 15 minutes. So it's something that just kept expanding, really, yeah.
So it wasn't intentional to...
Not originally, no. And in fact, I was thinking about how at that time, I think shortly afterwards, I got a Chisenhall commission for 15 minutes. It seemed to be a method of starting pieces, that there was a 15-minute commission, and then actually on that evening, you'd probably have 3 or 4 pieces of 15 minutes. And it was a good way to start a piece, because you weren't, aiming at an hour. Yeah. You started a very containable sort of ambition that then, if it warranted, got extended. So that's, that was its sort of start.
Yeah, it feels like times have changed since then, that you have to go for the full whack.
And I mourn that sort of very direct commission with a theatre that sort of, or a person. I remember Emma coming down to the studio, it's in Tooley Street, to watch the 15 minutes, and then we went to the pub after and had a chat. It felt like a very direct relationship with someone about the thing that you're doing, as opposed to a sort of... There was no theme given. I don't think, there was no sort of sense that it had to be part of something bigger or, obey the theme of that evening,
So what was that 15 minutes? What did it encapsulate, that 15 minutes, that first 15 minutes, and the clip that we're about to see? I
mean, I was trying to think, it's funny, because actually I know I was doing a workshop in the morning round the corner with Theatre de Complicité. They were doing, they were kind of going through this book, so there was something quite nice about, in the morning I'd be doing this workshop with these people, and then in the afternoon I'd just go to the Hot House, and I had a rule that I'd make 30 seconds a day. Sadly, as the days went on, I'd do that 30 seconds a bit quicker. So when it got to the end of the week, I'd still have 2.5 minutes to make, because I'd done, anyway. But I had this sort of, there was a bit of a thing I had about, around that time, there were a lot of people on, not a lot, but there were 1 or 2 people on TV, whistleblowers, I think probably for the health service, I'm not sure, who were, being asked, they were kind of voicing their concerns about something going on in, I'm sure it was the health service, but they were pixelated.
Right.
For the first time ever, I felt like people on TV couldn't say what they were worried about without having to disguise themselves. And it really, I don't know, it felt like the beginning of that kind of culture where people wanted to speak out but were scared in some way to speak out. And that sort of ran alongside my slight interesting crime reenactments. So really the piece kind of I kind of used that as a model. I bought quite a lot of criminal law books just to study the language of it. There was also, it was just shortly after I'd performed in a piece called Strange Fish with DV8, which had been very emotional as a piece. And I knew with the thing I wanted to make that I wanted to sort of be able to speak as opposed to kind of try and be accurate emotionally. And also using third person meant that you could distance yourself from emotion rather than become, really engaged in it. So it was a sort of combination of these three things, really, my sort of crime watch, these pixelated interviews that sort of kept bugging me, and then this sort of desire to make some form that had a little bit of coolness and structure and be able to lie, There's something quite nice that language can lie, which is, and it's, I can't say I'm someone's sister in movement. That's quite hard. Yeah. But I can just say that in language.
Yes.
And it can clearly be a lie or not, so it's it was something about language, being able to sort of comment on what I was physically doing. So that was the sort of combination of its starting points, I think.
This thing that we talked about at the beginning of in your intro about communicating clearly, I think, that's something that comes across. And actually, we're going to look at the first clip, or the first part of the clip, which is the opening, where we're in an auditorium at the Place, theatre in London. Yep. And then the audience or spectators, I don't know how you describe them, are waiting for you to step on stage. And then, we're going to watch it now.
Okay.
We start tonight with one of those tragic cases no one can understand. On Saturday, November the 15th, a young woman was attacked in the Houstoun area. We're appealing to anyone who saw anything on the night in question to come forward. Did you see a chair? Did you notice a jacket hanging on the chair? Do you remember seeing rows of people sitting, facing the same way? There's a substantial reward for witnesses with any information. And what follows now is a reconstruction using actors. We hope it will help you remember something. Anything.
Great. So, can you tell us more about this opening and how, from all the research you've done, how this came to be in that opening?
I suppose because it was presenting the idea of the entire performance as a crime, which probably many people might agree with me. No,
it's a
crime. She was allowed to do that, and it was also a way to to sort of use that language, but about the actual things that you're doing or the things that are in the space, so that you're kind of locating the situation, that the audience are complicit in it, they're witnesses, or they're people that are puzzling it out, like when you're watching, when you were watching Crime Watch, did you see someone cross the road that night? Yeah. Did you see something in the bushes? So it's it's a conceit really, but it's also just sort of saying this theatrical space. It was a bit complicated because you had to redo the announcement for each place. So It was always in the Houstoun area or in Australia or, wherever the piece was being done. The introduction was place specific.
And was it re-recorded every time with, what's his name?
Yeah, Nick Mercer. Yeah. I think there were some different people sometimes that had to do it because maybe... No, I think he generally did them because I knew where the gigs were going to be, so it would be, you'd plan it in advance. But and then the opening lines of the actual piece is sort of me coming and saying, it was, and putting in the past tense, you know, it was November the 13th, it was 8 o'clock. Outside it had been raining all day, and inside the lights are beginning to dim. So you're putting into the past tense the actual day that you're living in, and the position that you're in. So it's it was a lot playing with that kind of who the audience are, that this thing is something that's happened before and we're trying to get to the bottom of it, that I'm not even the person it happened to, I'm an actor reconstructing it. Yeah. You know, so it's kind of just playing. It speaks
to Crime Watch.
Yeah. And use it. I mean, but then, as I say, yes, using my performance as a potential crime, which I think many people have agreed with.
Was it intentional because we don't necessarily have any other films of Wales or placement of this work being performed in other cities? Was it always a male voice at the beginning? Because that was very right. Yeah. Was that what was the reason behind that, or did you just?
I think just though, I mean, Nick was he was an actor. He did voiceovers. Right. So he had a very voiceover voice. You know, it had that kind of clarity and authority to it. That sort of. There was someone else called Hugh Chadbourne that had an equally kind of... It was really for people, you know, there was a sort of quality to the voice that sounded very, you know, announcement-ish. Yeah. And I think voiceovers are quite hard to do. They're actually not... you know, there's a sort of energy in the voice that's very different to... I don't think I thought of a woman, not for any big deal reason, but, you know... Nick was someone I knew did voiceovers, so... Yeah,
it's just the reason why I touch on that, because there's a clear environment that was created with that, and then you stepping onto stage, which we're about to look at, and that shift, was that... Yeah, what was that conversation? How did that process come to be, that this is how I'm going to step in?
It was just sort of... Again, it was me introduce, you know, like there was an announcement that's nearly like a god-like announcement, because you don't see the person, it's just over the tannoy. And then, you know, the beginning of it is me just stepping into the sort of profile position on stage and kind of nearly repeating some of the conditions. You know, it was Saturday, it was something the 13th, it was about 8 o'clock. And it was sort of, you know, it was like me as a bridge between that sort of overall announcement and then taking it over as, you know, then she walked towards centre stage. Okay. So I'm sort of more like the narrator of the programme as opposed to the announcer or something. It was very instinctive though. I don't, you know, there was no heart-rending conversations about it.
What am I going to do?
Yeah, no, I mean, and actually, I think because of this sort of, like, having done the workshop in the morning, and I just had this rule, like, I'm going to make 30 seconds a day, really to sidestep this sort of, you know, this brain that's very self-critical when you make solos. You know, it's very... and I just make something, and it was there's something quite orderly about it, actually. And in a way, it was such a clear decision that once you'd made it, the only thing to do was sort of then play with the variety of things you're referencing, which, you know, kind of kept leaping between what I can see in the audience, what movement I'm doing, the memory of something that, you know, so you're just playing with the detail inside it, really.
Shall we look at that clip?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This Saturday was November the 15th. It was about 8 o'clock. Outside, the big grey awning, and inside, the lights were beginning to dim. She walked towards centre stage. And as she came to a stop, she remembers thinking she was glad she'd just been to the toilet. She moved her shoulders 3 times. She dropped her hip and let her head go. And as she moved to the side, she remembers noticing her t-shirt. She did some hip moves. She remembers thinking they were odd. She didn't do anything about it. She dropped and reached to the front. And as she turned back, she thought she saw someone she knew. But maybe it was just another stranger. She dropped and turned to the corner. And as she turned back, the movement of her wrist reminded her of an old lover. She eased back and noticed that the ceiling was black. And as she turned to the front, she remembers noticing someone on the front row. She remembers thinking, you never know what people are thinking. It was around this time that she thought she saw something moving around the back, but she thought maybe she was mistaken. She carried on, and as she continued, she had a strange sensation that she was being watched. Or maybe that she wasn't. She rose, and then she squeezed her legs together. The movement reminded her of wanting to have a piss. She carried on the diagonal, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. But as she reached behind her, she suddenly had a feeling that she was invisible. She got up, as if she was in a hurry. She started to sweat, as if she was in a panic. And she came to a stop. And it was after she'd embraced herself that she felt a pain, and it went dark. And as she rolled away, she remembers thinking it would be a while before she went out again.
Just watching the clip, there is this, it's just the simplicity of it, but also the complexity. And I think something that I kept on thinking actually when you spoke about making 30 seconds a day and having room to possibly play within those spaces. Mm-hmm. So where does the physical language, the verbal and the non-verbal play? How does that process work for you in that?
I mean, I think I wanted to, it's got, the voice is very monotone. I mean, I'm very quiet, so I know there's sort of, people tend to be straining to hear me. That's quite a traditional thing for me, I think. Because of the sort of flatness of the voice and the sort of, it's quite pedestrian movement almost in a way. Nothing I'm getting very puffed out doing, that's for sure. And so I wanted some of the sort of content of the words to let people know. I know that it could become po-faced, but so it's sort of, and you're kind of, the first thing is like, she walked towards centre stage and she remembers thinking she was glad she'd just been to the toilet. I mean, that's it's often the reality of performing on stage is you're really anxious, you're at the side of the stage and you're like, oh, I wish I'd gone to the toilet. So you're sort of embedding in quite a lot of what's usually not mentioned as the performer, that you turn and you think you saw someone you knew. That's often a very fleeting kind of thing that happens while you're busy doing something. But with this, I was mentioning it up front, in amongst, she thought she saw something moving around the back, which also was sort of like a move that's around the back, and it's ambiguous. So a lot of the language I was choosing for its ambiguity, it could be somebody moving around the back, it could be a movement around my own back, it could be something that's dramatic that I need to think about, or it could be an error. So it just, the ambiguity of it, and the timing and the spacing of it, and the simplicity, I think it was a sort of very, I mean, again, I sort of go back to those whistleblowing sort of pixelated interviews where, it's someone in silhouette, they kind of make a move, they make a statement, there's often sort of gaps, the interviewers sort of, there's a funny dynamic to it. You can't read everything, you can't read very much about them. Yeah. So it's sort of, you know, there's kind of a purposeful blank in it, and you're not really sure ever what the crime was, I don't think. I mean, it kind of riffs through as the piece advances. You know, the section after this sort of goes into much more of it's a litany of all the things that go through your mind when you're frightened at night on the streets. And it's funny, I mean, as a piece, it's sort of, it feels very resonant of a lot of things I hear people talk about now, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, especially.
Yeah, you know, sort of,
Yep.
you know, women getting attacked, and it's sort of, I mean, it's sort of something that feels like it's being articulated again in a very, or having to be articulated again. I mean, I think it's always needing to be articulated, but there was something, you know, in the last year or two that's been making me think about this piece, because it feels like it's, and a few people have contacted me even about, there was someone, I've always wondered if it's possible to remount it with someone else. Not something I've ever done, but I do keep wondering about that, and where it would need updating or transforming in some way, or where it wouldn't. But it feels, you know, that there's a sort of current, there's a current feeling to it.
There is one bit in this current thing, and the urgency of it is when, I think this is not verbatim, but there's a bit where you go releve, and you mention standing still, but it takes you a little while to get the balance. And that feels, until you settle and then you carry on. And there's something in that that's very present that feels that it can relate. Then and now.
I think it's just like she came to a stop, and then it's like, well, I'm physically not quite.
Yeah, that feels you cannot fake that. And I think this is what this whole what we're talking about, this this haunted thing. You cannot fake that when you have that sense of urgency, and that's something that feels very present in that.
Yeah, because it's also it's an act of self-scrutiny. A lot of the language, you're kind of articulating out loud what is usually a sort of silent, but inside your head quite noisy stream of consciousness that sort of, you know, oh, there's something in the corner, or you're coming to stop, or careful, you know. So they're sort of slightly flagged up. Ultra awareness, I would say, of, you know, and a kind of ambiguous imminent threat that's around you, but never sort of, you're never sure what that is really. I mean, at different scenes, there's very different, you know, there's a scene about going to a club, or there's a scene, so some things get very concrete, but as a sort of general, I think a general tone to the piece, it's just got this sort of like unspecific threat, you know, that's around, which also includes the audience. It
feels, and it feels very mundane, but at the same time, I think when you say taking this from centre stage, you move to stage right, and even that step I feel a bit like a bit voyeuristic, even observing that moment as a spectator, or watching it even through a video. I still feel that.
It's a very odd thing to articulate a stage direct, like, you know, she moves on the diagonal, and it's quite sort of like, ooh, I don't need to know that. You know, there's something a little bit odd to draw attention to the mechanics of the space, and then go back to a sort of much more emotional thing of her wrist reminds her of an old lover, and that, you know, so you're kind of constantly flipping, I think, between location, imagination, sort of some more emotional thing, which again is what I kind of realised language can do quite quickly. That.
Sorry, you mean the physical language or the verbal language?
Well, a bit of both. You know, they're both doing something to each other. So you know, they're kind of the verbal language is messing around with the actual bodily language, or the other way around, and also with the audience relationship. It's constantly. It's making it a lot more in a sort of blow by blow way, quite fluid, but more gymnastic than generally. With movement, you know, I tend to feel like it's sort of, you know, it stays on its course and its job for blocks of time, as opposed to sort of in a blow by blow way alter its kind of, you know, where am I, if you know what I mean.
But do you decide that before you go into the studio that you're going to make that 30 seconds, especially within that section of the pedestrian? I don't know how you describe it. Is that a decision for that section, or is that something that just comes with just the play?
I think I just made myself make stuff. It was a bit, you know, it's like, okay, you're going to walk, you're going to move your shoulders 3 times, you're going to do that and do that. Right, that's what you're doing.
And that's exactly what you did.
Yeah. And then, are you going to say that? And it was more than finding the space, the right kind of space between saying it, doing it. That's a bit too long to wait. You can't have that much language. You can't leave it that long. John Avery, who did the sound as well, who was someone that I'd worked. I mean, John Avery works with Forced Entertainment quite a lot actually, and he had been the sound operator when we filmed Strange Fish the previous year. He'd been the boom operator.
Right.
So we got chatting then and sort of ended up working like the following year on this piece. So there was a sort of history, a little bit of how Forced Entertainment had worked with language and sound, although the sound came in really, in my memory, as a sort of sound tracking device post the construction of the action, you know. It wasn't like I made it to the sound sort of thing.
Yeah, the sound has this airiness about it as well, not specifically speaking to the section we've seen, but generally as the piece goes on, when the vocals come into it. But yeah, it definitely has that layer that builds more and more as the piece goes on as well.
Yeah, it's very sort of suggestive, or, you know, it's like a film soundtrack to me in that sense. I mean, it's funny actually, I remember there's a club scene, I was just coming today past Hoxton, it was the bass clef. I remember going at night to the bass clef, and then sort of events of that evening are what one of the sections is. So it's really interesting, sort of, you know, even bits of London.
Where it's placed.
Is that's that scene, you know. And then some things are like, you know, I mean, there was a time where I think around the same time there was a text that a lot of people were referring to. It was a Peter Handke text called Self-Accusation that actually Forced Entertainment ended up doing a piece called Speak Bitterness that was kind of around that. And some of that made it either into some of the text, but also even in the, sometimes just taking a phrase like shooting yourself in the foot, and then literally just doing a scene where you hold up your own legs with at gunpoint and, you know, make them dance. You know, so they're kind of like one idea and then just do it, you know. So there's sort of really different sort of trigger points for different sections, I would say. Right. And there's a scene that sort of goes, it really goes back through time in sort of memory with compositing, you know, this was the song lyric of the time, and this is the movement that I did. And that had come from a conference up in Lancashire, Lancaster University, where there'd been a conference about documentation. And they were trying to, there was, on the panel, there was a geographer, a pathologist, who else? There were people talking about recording, making recordings of things. And someone said, oh, you know, movement's impossible to record. And my contention was movement's impossible to forget, you know. Everything I've ever done is like, it's burnt into my body, you know. Yeah. And so we did this thing where, you know, it's just, I mean, it was in a conference panel thing, so it was in a sort of, you know, conference room, and I just got people to call out various years from my birthday onwards, and was just doing these sort of spontaneous kind of, oh yeah, that was the year I was doing this, and I remember that song, and so actually that, you know, it had come from this sort of very live improv kind of structure, and then I, you know, within the piece it's set, but probably is more fun when it's live, called out, and it's quite hard to recall sometimes quite quickly, but I still feel that to be the case, that, you know, the sort of memory of movement that I've done, and especially things that have got repeated a lot, you know, they're burnt into the body, you know, shake them off if you can.
But it feels, they're burnt into the body, but I think, I mean, you cannot, well, can you fake it? That's a question, but we're not going to go too much into that.
I certainly can't repeat it now, because not capable.
But it's still very present, though. So
it's sort of inside.
It serves a purpose. Yeah.
I mean, that's the torture of sort of, or not torture, but it's the sort of joke of getting old somehow, that you kind of, you still got, I feel like the movement's still in me, and kind of like, you know, like I could get up and do it, and then when I get to go to do it, it's like, you know, it's kind of there in a neurological way, but I can't manifest it in any way, you know. And like, for instance, in the clip, you know, I think running up to that year, because I think that's about 97, and I had just been on tour with DV8 for most of that year, so I'm really match fit, you can tell in the, you know, and it's really like, there's an ease, which I rarely achieve, to be honest, because with solos, you tend not to get momentum. There's long gaps between when you made it, you get to do it again 6 months later, you know, and then you might not have worked very much, you know, that sort of maintenance of a kind of, for me anyway, I always found really complicated. So actually, if you're coming off the back of a very sustained tour and training system, then you're kind of like, oh, this is great, you know. And I can see it in my body. I think, oh, that looked surprisingly easy. What I remember other times going, oh God, I've got to sort of really work at finding it again, yeah.
Well, thank you, Wendy, for taking us through those clips. It's really absolutely just insightful to just get that process of that work as well. But thank you very much for doing this Choreographer's Cut. Absolute
My pleasure.
pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you.